So this morning, usually in the in-between Sundays, that is the Sunday between Christmas and New Year's, it's a kind of a one-off, right? Because we're not sure who's going to show up. We're not sure whether they're going to remember what happened last week. How many remember what happened last week? How many know it was about Star Wars? Regardless of what Darren said, that was what really it was about. Yeah. But last week and this week is part one and part two of probably, in some ways, the story that captures more than maybe any of the other stories that Jesus told, the kind of the heart of what he was about. You know that over the last few weeks we have been thinking about what Jesus really came to say, what he really came to do, what it really means for the kingdom to come under this kind of banner of real Jesus. And have been asking, what difference does what we have been celebrating over the last few weeks with Christmas and then heading as we do towards March and April into Easter, incarnation, resurrection, crucifixion. What does all that actually mean? Isn't it? Because we are gripped with a narrative. Stories matter to us. And in fact, I don't know if your experience was similar to ours over Christmas, and last night we went to some friend's place, but the whole evening is spent doing what? For the most part, it's telling stories and learning each other through the stories we are told. We bring new people into the family, don't we? By telling stories of those. So we had, girlfriends of our boys. And of course, we get to tell stories, embarrassing stories of our boys, right? That's part of that's the price of admission. You come to Thanksgiving, and now you get stories about our boys. And they're wonderful stories because they're wonderful boys, but they're also stories that you just you cringe just a little bit, you know? So what if you could capture, and this is why I think the wisdom of taking this kind of paradigmatic story in Luke chapter 15, the story of the prodigal son, so-called, that we learned last week is really the story of the prodigal father. The story is not really just about, or even primarily about, those who are lost who come home, although it certainly is that, for which all of us in the room are glad, because at one time or another, we are the lost boys, the lost girls who come and discover home again, right? But it is also about not just the down and outs, but the up and outs. Those who never left home and who are just as lost as those who stayed, who wandered far away. It's possible, Jesus is saying, to never leave the Father's house and still not know the Father's heart. And that's what we want to talk about today. You know the passage. We read it. I'm just going to take you through it again because it's important. It's one of three parables that Jesus teaches to get us into the heart of the Father. And so we're just going to look at the introductory verses in Luke chapter 15. If you have Bibles, turn with me there. I'm just going to use the one on the screen myself. Now the tax collectors, there's a star in the way I can't see. Tax collectors and sinners were gathering around Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Then he tells two stories about a shepherd who loses one of 100 sheep and spends the rest of that night looking for that sheep. And when he finds that sheep, lifts that sheep up and wraps him around his shoulders and carries him not back to the flock, but to the center of the village where he calls all of his friends to rejoice with him, to enter into the joy of the discovery of that one sheep that was lost. And then he tells a second story about a woman who, having lost one of the 10 coins that were her dowry, her savings, not simply savings in terms of finances, but literally her life savings. They were her security blanket if something were to go wrong in her relationships, which was not an uncommon thing. Women, the most vulnerable in a culture of brutality. And so her 10 coins, her dowry, was really her life insurance policy, and I mean that in a literal sense. They were what she was going to count on should something go sideways in her life. And she loses one of them and spends then the rest of the morning cleaning the house, sweeping, lifting, you know how it is, and finds that one coin, and then gathers together friends who again rejoice with her in the discovery of that which was lost. And then Jesus tells this story, which again continue. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got it together all that he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that country, and he began to be in need, so he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said to himself, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I'll go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him, and he ran to his son and threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe, put it on him, put a ring in his finger, sandals on his feet, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.' And so they began to celebrate." And then our text for this morning. "Meanwhile, the oldest son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and said, 'What's going on?' 'Your brother has come,' he replied. 'And so your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you, never disobeyed your orders. You never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me. Everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" This is a wonderful story. There's been so much written, so much taught on this. My guess is that probably most of us in the room this morning could probably say what I'm going to say today. You know where this is going. And that's okay. Christmas, as you know, is not about saying new things. It's saying the old thing really, really well. You just tell the story, right? You just tell the story. Don't improve on the story because you can't. If the incarnation story, the story of God's love, come down, born in a manger, becoming a human being, if that is true, you can't improve on that. And it's true. So we just want to tell it well. And this story, which is an extrapolation of that, we just want to tell it well. And it begins with this framing verse, verses 1 and 2. As he starts off, tax collectors and sinners were gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And you know the frame. I'm just going to set it up really, really quickly. You have these two groups of people who are overhearing, and then the disciples who are also overhearing. So you have tax collectors and sinners, you have scribes and Pharisees, and then you have the crowd, if you will, the disciples who are listening in to this. And the Pharisees are the ones who kind of trigger the action. They are murmuring, they are talking to one another. Now please notice, this isn't necessarily an angry talking. The Pharisees are at this stage in Jesus' ministry still trying to figure out where to file him. Where does he fit into our understanding of what a rabbi is supposed to do? That was their job. They were the ones who were charged with the purity of Judaism. Now, as it turns out, they were self-charged with that. Nobody asked them to do that. But they assumed that role coming out of the Babylonian exile, which we've talked about at times. And they had come to the conclusion that if we could just purify Judaism, if we could just purify Israel for even one day, Messiah would come and deliver us. So their task was to act as the arbiters of purity for Judaism. That's what they understood them. And remember, the crowds highly respected and revered these scribes and Pharisees. They were the ones to whom you went seeking an authoritative opinion about what was right or wrong for you to do, what would keep you in good standing with God, and what would put you on the other side of the line that you don't want to be on. Does that make sense? So they were highly regarded. So when it says they were murmuring, all it means is they were talking to one another and trying to figure out how to make sense of what they were seeing. This new rabbi in town was doing something that appeared to them to be contradictory to what a rabbi teaching the way of God ought to do. He was welcoming, he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, people who were clearly on the outside edge. And Jesus, this new rabbi, was by his welcome of them, by his eating with them, was validating them as persons. How do we make sense of that? That's not how this works. Holiness must be preserved, and so we got to keep those people out. Right? And so Jesus tells these stories of one who has come to rescue those people, to include them in this. And we love this story. How many of you find yourself identifying with the lost sheep, right? Or the lost coin, or the lost boy who wanders far away and finds himself returning home, there to be greeted not with shame and condemnation, but with welcome, with embrace, with a table spread. We love this story as long as we identify with the lost. But if we identify with the elder brother, this isn't a fun story. right? This isn't maybe necessarily good news. And my problem, of course, is that I'd love to be able to identify with the prodigal, and I'll even make up stories of prodigality so that I can identify with them. How many know what I'm talking about? Especially for those of us who've been raised in church, right? We want a testimony. And what happens is we forget you only have to be the elder brother by 10 minutes to start to look down your nose at the people who come to the party after you arrived. It doesn't take us very long before we assume pride of place. It doesn't take us very long before we become the ones who are the arbiters of who ought get in and who ought stay out. Doesn't take very long, does it? And so Jesus tells this story about me. About me. And let's I'm just going to flash through it again, Alyssa, and we'll just go through it. So once again, he tells a story. A man who had 2 sons. Younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of estate. Last week we learned again that in order for the father to accomplish this, he would have had to liquidate part of his estate. It wasn't like he had stocks and bonds that he could liquidate. It was property, ancestral property that he had to sell to accomplish what his younger son requires, wishing essentially with that request that his father be dead. Powerful. And the father, you'll notice, does it. So the younger son gets together, goes off, spends his wealth on while living. He has not been trained in how to live with what he has. And so in a matter of months, he is through it, longs to fill his stomach. And for a Jewish audience, right, this is the lowest of the low. He is digging a hole after scraping the bottom of the barrel. So he is down as low as he can go and now gets a pickaxe out and starts to go lower. That's the story. And then he comes to his senses. He wakes up one morning with a realization, and often the church has confused this with repentance. He's not repenting. He's trying to save himself. He's not sorry that he's done what he's done. He's sorry that he is where he is. He's not even all that anxious about having done what he did to get where he is. He's just sorry that tonight he woke up under a bridge somewhere. How do I not make this happen again? How do I get out of this mess? How many of you have repented just wanting to get out of the mess? All right? So he comes back home, and please notice, this is the part I love about this. He knows his father's heart, and he's willing to take advantage of it. That just annoys the heck out of me. Right? Because what's he doing? I'm going to go to my father and I'm going to say to him what? Father. No. You wished him dead. Who are you to say again, Father? Who are you to say that? Right? But he knows his father, that as soon as he hears that word, his father will turn to him as a father, treat him as a father would, not as a son deserves. Do you see what he's doing? The guy's, he's not stupid. He's playing the game here. He's playing the system here. Right? This, by the way, is spoken as an older brother. Me. Because I know what that snake in the grass is up to. And you just want to say to the father, watch out, he's going to burn you again, don't you? Okay, so he comes home, sees him, and the father sees him a long way off, and of course, he just does what a father does. He just does what a father does. He's filled with compassion, for crying out loud. You know, what is it that our former president blew so badly? You burned me once, shame on. But here's the father ready to be burned again. Move with compassion. That hasn't worked out for you so well in the past. Right? Runs to him, throws his arms around him, kisses him. Father, I have sinned against heaven. And you can almost hear the recitation of the lines. He's memorized it step by step on his way back from the pig pen. Father, see, now if I say this first, then maybe it'll happen. Yeah, okay, I thought, let me do that. He recites his lines, and the father then almost completely, he's not acting on the son's repentance. He's acting out of his own heart. This is a parable not about the son who comes home, but about the father who welcomes him. This is the point. This is why Jesus told the story, of course, right? Father, I've sinned against heaven, against you, no longer worthy to be called your son, and on it goes. So he welcomes him back, and not simply saying, come and grab a cup of coffee, don't let the door hit you on your way out, but welcomes him back into the system. Bring a robe, bring a ring, give him his place. Has a big celebration. This son of mine was dead and is alive, is lost and is found. They began to celebrate. Go on to the next one, Alyssa. And here's where our text begins. Meanwhile, the eldest son was in the field. What was he doing in the field? He was taking care of the father's resources. He was doing his job. He was doing his duty. So when he comes home after the end of the long day working in the field, minding the father's business, and he hears the music, and he is upset by this, as well he might, calling one of the servants, he said to him, what's going on? Well, your brother's come home. Your father's killed the fattened calf. It's time to celebrate. And I love how Jesus just sets us up with one or two words in the next frame. His older brother became angry. Became angry. We've talked about this before, but remember that anger is the emotion that we have that signals a boundary violation. Right? It's a protector emotion that God has given us. It needs to be carefully calibrated with love and joy, right? But anger is how we both identify and respond to a boundary violation. Something has happened that ought not to have happened. And anger is not an inappropriate response when that occurs, right? We need it to train. We need it to be calibrated appropriately. But at the end of the day, I don't want to ever not be able to become angry when there's a boundary violation, particularly if it's a boundary violation against someone who has no capacity to respond on their own. Jesus became angry, never on his own sake, but on behalf of children, on behalf of women, on behalf of lepers, on behalf of people who are marginalized, the Gentiles. He became angry on their behalf because they had no voice in that culture. Never on his own. Here's a young man with whom I identify completely, unfortunately, who becomes angry when he sees his younger brother receiving something that his younger brother ought not receive. Did you catch that? How many know the younger brother was treated way better than he deserved to be treated? Right? The younger brother didn't deserve what the father was doing. And the father treats him out of his character, not out of the son's behavior. The older brother becomes angry because this is a boundary violation. His father is being taken advantage of. And of course, whose stuff is he doing it with? It's the elder brother's inheritance that is being used to throw a party for the younger brother's return. You know the bumper sticker on the back of the RV heading down Route 66. We're spending our children's inheritance. Because when the younger son left, with 1/3 of the estate, that left 2/3, which by rights went to the older son. So whose goat was it that was being killed to party? Do you see? And then he goes on, refuses to go in. And here is where, again, the father steps out of his appropriate role, not simply embracing the son back, which was a social embarrassment that the elder son feels. He goes into the bar at the end of a long day's work, and you can hear the volume drop. Everybody's embarrassed for him because of his father's behavior. That's not how the oldest generation ought to behave.
That's right.
And the younger son calls that out. The older son, however, feels the shame of his father's generosity. He wants to defend him. He refuses to go in, and the father, true to character, comes out and pleads with him. This is, again, not how fathers ought to relate to their sons in that culture. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you. I've never disobeyed your orders. You never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate my friends with my friends." And yet when this youngest son, notice, of yours, who's wasted your property on prostitutes, how in the world did he know that? You kill the fattened calf for him. Do you feel the resentment? How many can identify with that resentment? Nobody? You liars? You're all liars. Right? I mean, don't you just feel that? Don't you just want to get in that guy's corner and say, "You go! Tell that old man that he's an embarrassment to old men everywhere." This is not, how in the world is the younger generation ever going to learn to behave if they don't smarten up? If they get rewarded when they say, "I'm sorry," how in the world are we ever going to conform behavior appropriate to the kinds of people that we actually are? Then he goes on, "My son," you feel the heartbreak in that? "My son," listen to this next line, "everything I have is yours." There's a whole lot of difference between having something and having it. You have all of the stuff, you have all of the property, but none of the heart. Everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate. We had to be glad. And notice how he tries to pull his family back together again. This brother of yours has come home. The word that's missing in this third story that is present and predominant in stories numbers 1 and 2 is the word joy. It doesn't occur. Remember, when the shepherd gets the sheep, what does he do? He rejoices. Joy is a predominant emotion. When the woman discovers the lost coin, what does she do? She rejoices. Joy is a predominant element. And it's not that joy is absent in this, it's that joy is uncorked in this. It's no longer contained in the three-letter word joy. It now erupts as the polka begins. It now erupts as the dance music starts. It now erupts as the bottles are opened and the glasses are poured and the meal is prepared. So joy is not just an emotion that we describe as belonging to other people. Joy now becomes embodied in the celebration, in the party. So when the son refuses, standing outside the door, leaning against his tree of resentment, when he refuses to go in, what is he refusing to enter into? The joy of his Father. The joy of his Father. And why? Because he's never, for all the years he's been living there, learned the love of his Father. How is that possible? How is that possible? My guess is that if I took a few minutes and went around the room, you could tell me how that's possible. It's possible because for those of us like me who grew up in church, I've spent my whole life, you know my story, saved out of a life of sin and degradation at 4.5. That's my story. Right? And there is a superiority that creeps in. A resentment that creeps in. There is a sense in which I deserve. There's a sense in which I'm entitled. There's a sense in which it's my party. Do you catch this distinction? And here's the weird thing. Over the years, I have walked with people over the years who 10 minutes in embody the elder brother. Looking down their nose with resentment, looking at themselves with entitlement, looking at the father with bitterness and anger. Because and notice that this is a false economy. If the Father is generous to one, it doesn't mean that he has less for you. If the Father is gracious to one, it doesn't mean that grace is exhausted in the newbie. It means there's, oh wait, the only reason you're in is because grace is available for you too. Who deserves the party? Nobody deserves the party. Not the elder son. Why is he doing what he's doing? He's doing what he's doing out of tight-fisted, iron-hearted obedience. There's nothing worse than teeth-grit obedience. You know what I mean? I have a, because if this story is about joy, you'll notice how duty is not the same thing as joy. Now, please don't misunderstand me. Duty is a very good thing. Duty might be, obedience might be the expression of love. But if it's not the expression of love, if it's not the expression of joy, even obedience is useless. It doesn't take very long before we move into a church, before we move into a community, before we move into the family of God, the kingdom of God. And because of God's grace, because of God's goodness, our past is not the most important thing that's said about us. Hallelujah. And we start to move up in the ranks. We assume positions of responsibility. We maybe even get a title at a church. Because we've jumped through the hoops. How do we treat the new ones that come in? How do we accept and embrace the ones who don't deserve to be here? Do you see where this is going? Is it possible to be doing the Father's will and not knowing the Father's heart? Is it possible to have the Father's stuff, the position, the place, the responsibility, and not be gripped by the Father's heart. If the elder brother had been gripped by the Father's heart, he would not have made the Father come out to the resentment tree to drag him back to the party. He would have been celebrating with his brother's return. But his anger prevented him. How many know what that feels like? I know what that feels like. I know what that feels like. Because the deal is, and I mean, you've followed me with this, but talk about adventures and missing the point. Right? To miss the joy of the Father, which is what this story is about. To miss the joy of the kingdom. I mean, doesn't it remind you of those YouTube videos with the little kids? And Christmas morning? With a child who gets what he didn't expect, an avocado was the big one making the rounds. Right? Who didn't get what he was expecting and is robbed of the joy of Christmas because his younger brother got something that he wanted. Just had a 3-year-old meltdown because it wasn't what he was expecting. Anybody else feel like that 3-year-old sometime? How come you're so good to them? I could tell you a thing or two about them. I know their story. I know they don't deserve your grace and your goodness. They don't deserve that. And here, what about them? Who am I? Chopped liver? I prayed for a healing from cancer, and you didn't heal me. You didn't deliver me. You didn't fix this or that or the other. You didn't. And these guys are in 10 minutes, and they get a miracle. What's up with that? You can't do grace by comparison. You can't do joy by comparison. Entitlement, expectations are the robbers, the stealers of joy. The elder brother has a lesson to teach us. And the last time I talked on this, the image that haunted me is that the chapter ends without resolution. Doesn't that bother you? The older brother, as far as we know, the curtain falls, the lights in the theater come up, and everybody's sitting there saying, where's the ending? Is the boy going to go in? Or if it's a postmodern play, is the younger son going to come back out? Because that worm, I'll tell you, he's going to turn. Right? That's what happens when you trust those people. Those people. That's what happens. Do you see? And it's not a parable about what the boys do. It's a parable about who the Father is. It's a story that invites us to not make it about us, much less about somebody else, but to find ways to speak, to know the Father's heart, to choose joy. There is no envy. There is no jealousy worse than spiritual envy or spiritual jealousy. It will crush your soul and wring every ounce of joy out of it, and you will be doing your duty and killing people in the doing so. You will crush their souls like your own has been crushed. Does that sound harsh? It's just true. How do I know it's true? I know it's true. I know it's true. So what are we left with here? what we discover is that the kingdom is not fair. Grace is not fair. And if I don't learn this, I'm not going to be able to enter into the joy of the Father. Christmas, after all, is the season of unfair joy. Can I just ask you not to miss it because all the presents aren't for you? Let's pray.